Welcome to Vantage Points. I'm Hisham Al-Maligi. With me today is Dr. Mohamad Elmasry for the first time on Vantage Points. Dr. Mohamad is faculty member in the Department of Communications at the University of North Alabama. He is also associate professor and chair in the Media and Cultural Studies and Journalism programs at the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies in Qatar, where he is joining us from today. Dr. Elmasry received his PhD in mass communication in 2009 from the University of Iowa, where he was a presidential fellow. He is a political and media analyst who appears regularly on local and international media networks, including CNN, BBC, Huffington Post, Al-Jazeera, German public television, Swedish TV, and the Australian ABC News. Welcome, Dr. Mohamad Elmasry, and thank you very much for joining me today on Vantage Points.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So why don't you first tell us more about yourself so we get to know you better?
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, in the Midwest, Minnesota. I did my PhD, as you mentioned, at the University of Iowa. I have a master's and an undergraduate from the University of Minnesota. All of my degrees are in media studies, mass communication. I've been living overseas for the most part since 2009. I worked at the American University in Cairo for a while. I was forced to leave Egypt because of the military in 2013. And obviously I'm in Qatar now, and I still have my affiliation in the United States. As a media scholar, I do a lot of work on American news portrayals of race and racism. I also do work on representations of terrorism, representations of Muslims in the mass media, and I've also done some work on Arab media like Al-Jazeera and also the Egyptian news apparatus. So that's kind of what's been keeping me busy.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So let's start by taking you, first of all, are you and your family okay during this pandemic thing, and how are things in Qatar considering the COVID-19 situation?
Yeah, thankfully, alhamdulillah, we're doing fine. My mom is out here visiting, so from Minneapolis, and so she's kind of stranded out here. But I think it's all, inshallah, for the best. We're all doing fine. Qatar, I think, really got out ahead of the problem. They shut down well before the United States did, for example. But there are still a lot of cases here. So I think that, which only has a population of like 2.7 million. I think today they surpassed 5,000 COVID-19 cases. So, but fortunately, there have only been 8 deaths. So I would say the situation is contained, but certainly still a concern, a problem.
Understood. So you mentioned that Qatar closed before the United States. And while we're at the topic, let's address how the United States responded to the COVID-19 situation compared to, for example, South Korea, to China, to Europe. How do you see it from abroad, from overseas? Because sometimes we in the United States are receiving, in a way, and you're the media professor, you tell me, kind of a one-sided view of things. But people outside the United States, and my experience, like I used to get better information about the United States when I am overseas. So how do you see the COVID-19 response was in comparison, and especially the media coverage of the issue?
Yeah. So first of all, in terms of the media coverage, in general, I agree with you that it is difficult to get sort of fair coverage of the United States power apparatus from within the US media system. That has historically been a problem. If you look at the peer-reviewed research, it shows for the most part that American news media tend to sort of toe the government line. But what is interesting, and I think we have to be, fair about this. What is interesting about the Trump era is that that has been kind of flipped on its head a bit. The overwhelming majority of mainstream news media in the United States, whether we're talking about television news outlets like CNN and MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC, or newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and dozens of others, those news outlets have been very critical of Donald Trump and his administration. So I just wanted to clarify that at the outset. But in terms of how the Trump administration has handled the crisis, I think that it's been pretty disastrous. And I mean, even if you listen to fair-minded voices on the American right, they'll tell you the same thing. Trump himself has been, displeased with some of the coverage on Fox News, which is a very far-right news network, obviously in the United States. But they've had to call at least some of it as it is. The U.S. was way behind in terms of just even recognizing the problem, to say nothing of actually taking steps. And Dr. Anthony Fauci even came out and said last week, much to Trump's chagrin, that many lives could have been saved had the United States acted more quickly. Obviously, Trump is trying to present a different narrative. He's saying that they're doing a great job, that no one else could have done better. But it's pretty easy to see that that's just propaganda. There's not really any substance to any of that, and I don't think anybody takes that seriously, other than Trump's diehard supporters. But Trump wants the country to be open. I think that what the United States has done in terms of trying to contain the virus is actually going against Donald Trump's own kind of predilections and instincts. I don't think he's been on board with much of this. He wants the country to open up immediately, and if it were up to him, if the U.S. were a true dictatorship, I think that would have been the case already. We saw yesterday protests across the United States. Really, these were pro-Trump rallies in several U.S. states where people are taking to the streets, defying stay-at-home orders and trying to urge their local governments, their governors, to reopen their states. We saw this in Michigan, we saw it in Minnesota and several other states. And Trump took to Twitter and said in a number of tweets, liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate these states. And some people, I think, took that as kind of almost like a call to arms, or at least a call to civil unrest at a time when, needless to say, the United States doesn't need that.
Definitely. And as far as the coverage of what's going on inside the United States from countries outside, like let's say Germany, England, Korea, China, are you following such coverage? Do you hear what they say about what's going on in the United States?
To be honest with you, only casually. I don't have anything systematic to offer you, but what I am seeing has been pretty critical for the most part of Trump, the actions that the U.S. government has taken, and in particular Trump's discourse. I think that that's one of the things that has jumped out to me. That really, sadly, and I say this as not as a media scholar, but really as an American, it is sad to see the perception of the United States now abroad. I interact with a lot of people who are from all over the world, either here in Qatar or when I travel to conferences. And this predates the COVID-19 crisis, but people are asking me as an American, as though I have the answers, like, what is going on? Like, how is it possible that the United States, this supposed beacon of rational thinking and democracy and human rights, and how is it possible that they elected Donald Trump in the first place? And then even more importantly, how is it possible that such a substantial percentage of the population continues to support him right through what can only be described as gross negligence and incompetence. And that's to say nothing of the human rights violations and the bigotry and the racism. That's leaving all of that aside and sticking only to policy.
I guess those are haters who don't like stable geniuses. I'm kidding. But anyway, so talking now about the 2020 elections and how do you see it's going now that Bernie bowed out and endorsed Biden, and a lot of people look at Biden's history and performance, especially during the beginning of the Iraq War when he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. A lot of the people are saying they will just stay out, similar to those who stayed out in 2016 when Hillary was the candidate. How do you see this going forward? And do you think that a significant number will stay out this election like last time, allowing Trump to win with slim margins in some swing states? Or because of the performance of Trump, people will push themselves to go out and vote for Biden?
Okay, well, there's a lot there. First of all, let me say that I think folks should take what I say with a grain of salt or several. I have gotten a lot of things wrong. When it came down to Clinton versus Trump very early on in 2016, I predicted that Clinton was going to win. And then when Trump did win, I suggested that it was likely that he would be a one-term president, that he would alienate a lot of people, and that he would lose support. Well, here we are nearing the end of his first term, and his approval ratings are higher now than they've ever been. So it's really it's a situation that I think has defied a lot of conventional logic about politics and political science. And in fairness to me, I think a lot of people have gotten some of these predictions wrong. In terms of what's going to happen going forward, I think that Trump is in a really good position. Sadly, I was surprised that Bernie Sanders dropped out when he did. In the middle of this crisis, which seems to highlight the need for some of the social programs like universal health care that he supports. So I was surprised by the timing. I thought that he might try to stick it out a little bit longer, particularly since I think about half the states have not yet voted. In any case, it was clear that the Democratic establishment was behind Joe Biden, and he received key endorsements from all over the American left, despite problems with his cognitive health and problems also with his policy history. I think that right now the presidency is Donald Trump's to lose. I'm talking about 2021 to 2024. He's certainly the front runner. He has an awful lot of support, and I don't see the American left really galvanizing behind Joe Biden. And you mentioned Clinton. I actually think things are worse now for Biden than they were for Clinton. You mentioned people that sat out in 2016. When you actually look at the numbers, the overwhelming majority of Bernie Sanders supporters voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 once she won the nomination. There were actually comparatively few people sitting out or voting third party. What I'm seeing, and this is just anecdotal, but what I'm seeing is that people that were supporting Bernie Sanders, many of them now are saying, this is not like 2016. I'm sitting out. I cannot possibly vote for Joe Biden because of his policy record, whether we're talking about his foreign policy record with the Iraq War, for instance, or his history of racism, the 1994 crime bill, his support for segregation, other problems with his policy record, but also his cognitive decline, which is obvious if you've seen any of his interviews, the debate, his speeches. he's just not somebody that I think is going to generate a lot of support and interest on the American left. And again, I've gotten this wrong many times before, but right now, if you're asking me here in late April, I think that Trump is probably going to be a two-term president.
Well, it's sobering, but I have to agree with you that that's my estimation as well. And speaking of wrong estimations, I had to shave my head on Facebook Live because I said I will do so if Hillary loses the election. So most people got it wrong. So
Okay. Can I go back and watch that? Is there a link available? I'd like to see that.
I'll put it in the caption of the video once it's up.
All right, great.
So speaking of back also in 2016, I remember Trump is saying wants to have a total and complete shutdown of Muslim immigration to the United States until we figure out what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
The first ban came with a 90-day term, and we're in day 1200 plus now. What do you see this issue of the Muslim ban, how it's progressed, where it is today, and how do you see it in the future, especially the fights against it in the court?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if Trump wins a second term, and as the Republicans continue to try to consolidate power, then you could expect probably the ban to be expanded. Democrats have won some important victories in the courts, so it's not necessarily going to be easy for Trump. A lot of support in the American public for a total ban, a total shutdown, and I think it's important to note. Trump said people are giving him credit. His supporters are giving him credit for fulfilling his campaign promise. But what he promised was a full and complete shutdown of all immigration and travel from the Muslim majority world. We're talking about more than 40 countries. So this ban, which is, I don't remember how many Muslim majority countries are in the latest, the current ban. I think it's 6 or 7. So we're talking about something that's very scaled down. It's still horrible, and but it's not what he wanted and what he promised during his 2015-2016 campaign period. But Trump is somebody who said that Islam has a problem with us. He said that in 2016. Mm-hmm. He said that 27% of Muslims are terrorist types. No one knows where he got that number. So he's made all kinds of problematic statements about Muslims, about Islam, both when he was campaigning, while he's been the president, and even before he even entered the American political scene. He blamed Muslims he accused Muslims of celebrating 9/11. You'll recall that as a New Yorker.
Yeah.
So.
I don't recall celebrating. I recall him saying that.
Yeah, him saying that. Yeah,
it's important to note.
Absolutely. So he has a very problematic history with Islam. You see that I think he's given unfortunately, a lot of confidence to other Islamophobes that are, doing the rounds on the conservative talk shows on the radio and on Fox News and elsewhere, and they've said all kinds of outlandish things about Muslims and Islam. Even if you look inside his own administration, he's aligned his administration with noted Islamophobes. So unfortunately, I think you can expect more of that. I think the silver lining, though, is that we haven't had an organized opposition movement like this really since the civil rights era. There have been more protests during the first 3 years of the Trump administration than during any other 3-year period since the civil rights era ended. And then there's more political participation and organizing on the part of minorities and religious minorities. People are running for political office that never would have thought about running prior. So I think that's the silver lining. The other thing that I would say to people who are feeling dejected is that the demographics don't really work in favor of the American far right. It's an aging demographic, and the youth of the United States, by and large, do not support Donald Trump and the Republican policy agenda. So 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, we can probably expect a very different picture.
Yeah, well, we have to endure it for the time being. And speaking of the emboldening of the racists, one of the best responses to the Trump famous hat of Make America Great Again is make racists afraid again. That was a very clever play on the term.
I've seen that.
Yeah. So I want to talk about, because I've seen you, followed you on Facebook, and there was a discussion going, requesting basically from those who say vote blue no matter who, and Biden might not be the best, but he's better than Trump. Do you really see him as better after everything is said and done, or we're going to end up with another Obama, literally his vice president?
Very hard question. First of all, let me say that I avoid telling people what to do. I've never, on my Facebook or anywhere else, I've never told people vote for this person, vote at all, don't vote. But people ask me all the time why. I don't know why anybody cares what I think. I don't know, but people do ask me. So what do you think? What are you going to do? How are you going to vote? And so I have responded. And I have the right to change my mind. We still have several months ahead of us, inshallah. But as of right now, I'm not planning to vote for anybody in the 2020 election. As of now, I've decided that I cannot give my voice to Joe Biden. I'm fundamentally and morally opposed to much of his history. I talked about the crime bill, which devastated Black communities and still devastates Black communities to this day. I talked about his support for Iraq, which was passionate and vociferous. And really, as bad as Trump is, and he's awful, I don't know that there's any single thing that he's done that can be compared in terms of just sheer evil and destruction on a quantitative or qualitative level as the Iraq War or the Iraq invasion. Really, I don't even think we should call it a war. I don't think that's a fair characterization. So I'm not going to personally, just right now, I can't get behind a Joe Biden candidacy, and I'm not planning on voting for him. The other question, though, that you raised is the complicated one: is Biden as bad as Trump? Is he the lesser evil? And you can make a strong, to be fair, and I have a lot of respect for the people who are coming out on Facebook and on Twitter and saying, we have to vote for Joe Biden because he's the lesser evil. I'm not going to tell anybody not to do that. I have my own, decision-making process, and I'm going to vote for Mohamad Elmasry. I'm going to do what I think is best for me, but I can't tell anybody else what to do. And I have respect those people that are my friends, they're my teachers, my mentors. So I'm certainly not going to disrespect them. But I would say that I struggle a little bit with it because I think that certainly in the short term, you can make a strong argument that Joe Biden is the lesser evil, but I'm not intellectually convinced personally that over the long term, a Biden is the lesser evil, that a Biden presidency would be the lesser evil. And the reason I say that is because I believe the system in the United States, or at least aspects of the system, need to be really just completely overhauled. They need to be flipped inside out. And for that to happen, really the hope is the Democrats or the American left or some sort of leftist or progressive movement. And I don't think it can happen, at least based on my calculations. I don't think it can happen if every 4 years, everybody on the American left, all the progressives, throw their hands up and say, okay, well, we're going to vote for you no matter what. And that's literally the, you give us Hillary Clinton, we don't like her, we disagree with her policy history, but we're going to vote for her anyways. And now the same thing with Joe Biden. And it was the same thing even with Obama for many people. So why then does the Democrat establishment have to get the message? Why do they have to change if they're going to get people's votes regardless?
And do you actually see significant difference after everything is said and done between the duopoly of the Democrats and the Republicans, especially, for example, when it comes to foreign policy? Of course, it's connected to everything domestically, surveillance, civil rights, economy. But do you see a significant difference between the current establishment in both parties?
I want to be fair, I mean, on a number of issues, there isn't a big difference, right? And people are pointing that out. I mean, you talked about foreign policy. There are probably even very small handful of issues about which maybe the Republicans are even slightly better than the Democrats, at least according to some people based on their politics. But overall, I do think there is a difference on a number of areas. And I do think I think the Republicans are noticeably worse. I mean, we could go through the examples, but I mean, if you take climate change as just one example, which I happen to think is a very important issue. I have 2 young children, so and I'd like them to, to live long and happy lives. I'd like them to be able to have children, and I hope their future is bright. So that's a major issue for me. The Republicans are awful on climate change. To take one example, there's a clear difference there between the Democrats and the Republicans. There are also other differences. I mean, healthcare. There's what the Democrats did under Obama with Obamacare, but it was at least a step in the right direction. So those are 2 examples, and there are many others actually.
Okay, I mean, it's hard for me because, I mean, I'm a human from Earth. That's how I look at myself. I don't consider borders to be legitimate for the sake of, like, when talking about separating humanities. So what happens in Japan or in China or anywhere else in the world does affect me here in the United States and in my home country of Egypt. So the foreign policy in particular of the United States, and many studies and many books have been written how it is being used as a proxy for powers beyond the American interest. So when we bomb countries for no reason but to get their resources or based on absolute lies like the Iraq War, these things affect not only the people over there, but it affects us here, especially, for example, after 9/11, they introduced, I mean, it was ready on the shelf, the Patriot Act. And and there is nothing patriotic about it whatsoever, as you know, because it affected, at the time, yes, Muslims, but now it's starting to affect everyone else. So when it comes to this issue in particular, I'm not sure there is a significant difference between both parties in it. And look at the track record of Obama versus Trump. Obama started 2 or 3 new wars, and Trump so far did not start any, except, of course, bombing in Syria and in Iran, but it's not a full-scale war like the complete destruction of Libya, for example. So that alone is the reason which, like, kind of covers over all the other, what I call subtle differences. But I
Yeah.
understand, of course, there are some differences.
Well, I don't disagree with you. The issues that I was talking about are climate change is a global issue. It's not a foreign policy issue per se. Healthcare and the other examples that I would give are mostly domestic policy issues. On foreign policy, and you're right, there's been a lot of research devoted to this, there isn't a big difference at all between Republicans and Democrats. We talked about Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is actually more hawkish than many Republicans. Joe Biden was more passionate in voicing his support for the invasion of Iraq than many Republicans were. You talked about Barack Obama. Barack Obama's foreign policy legacy, as far as I'm concerned, is pretty disastrous. He greatly expanded the drone wars. He bombed, I don't remember the final tally, but a large number of countries. Many civilians were killed. So those are all Democrats. And historically, it hasn't differed a great deal based on whether the president is a Democrat or a Republican. I'm trying to remember the famous quote that's always mentioned in the political science books, and I'm trying to remember who said it first. In any case, it says, I'm just going to paraphrase it, and then people can Google it. It says something like, there is an essential continuity in American foreign policy. And I want to say it was Bill Clinton who said that, but don't quote me on that. But the quote is accurate, or the meaning is accurate, at a minimum as a paraphrase, that there's an essential continuity in U.S. foreign policy. And so that's why you don't see a great deal of jumping around when you have a switch over from a Republican to a Democrat, or from a Democrat to a Republican.
If it was Bill Clinton, that's kind of an open admission of the existence of what is known as the deep state. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, I mean, we have to define what we mean by the deep state first, but I'll say that I think that there's a strong establishment in the United States, and I think that there is a hegemonic foreign policy ideal that all presidents have to live up to, or at least try their best to live up to. And we see that play out repeatedly. That's what I'll say to that.
Okay, so we know for sure that AIPAC plays a role in that, and that's like so many books and documentaries have been made about that. But what other power groups or lobbies do you see also influencing the United States policy the world?
Well, good question. I'm busy trying to find that quote, and I shouldn't be doing this in the middle of a podcast. But
that's okay.
Obviously, I'm sure you've spent time talking about the influence of AIPAC. There have been a lot of studies on their influence. There was a famous book written by Mearsheimer and Walt about the influence of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. They exert tremendous influence over American policy. Another country that has been exerting quite a lot of influence of late is the United Arab Emirates, and I think that's a really fascinating. The United Arab Emirates are this relatively small country in the Persian Gulf that has allied with Israel, that has allied with the most prominent Islamophobes on the American right and on the European right. And they've really been investing a lot of time, energy, and money into the American political system and trying to influence American policy and also American media coverage. One of the things that I think is fascinating that I tell my students about, and they're always, the United Arab Emirates established a sort of a lobbying firm in California called the Camstow Group, spending many millions of dollars establishing this firm. I think it was in 2012 or 2013. What's fascinating is the people that were essentially running and operating this firm were former Bush administration officials. The second thing that was fascinating is that their main objective was to try to plant negative Qatar in the American news. And I just think that that's absolutely fascinating. And they have had a lot of success, unfortunately. And if anybody's interested, this has all been covered pretty thoroughly. If you want to just search The Intercept and Camstol Group, Camstoll. But again, the UAE has, you read a lot of these news reports about Qatar and its alleged ties, news reports about the Arab Spring and the Muslim Brotherhood and all of these weird ties and relations. A lot of that is driven by the United Arab Emirates.
Very interesting. And I think the Washington Post also wrote an expose about that. Was it the UAE that bought Jeff Bezos?
I believe you're right. I believe you're right on that.
So they used an Israeli company to plant a spy software on Jeff Bezos' own cell phone, and Jeff Bezos owned the Washington Post.
Yeah, absolutely. So
it's very interesting. So how do you see now the coverage as a media professor talking about the American foreign policy, especially towards what is known as the Middle East? I don't know middle of where and east of what, but that's the term that's been used for decades. The coverage in the American media, ever since 9/11, of course, there has been a campaign, and tell me if you agree with this assessment of mine. I have seen the year that Mohamad Morsi was president in Egypt. He was the candidate from the Muslim Brotherhood Freedom and Justice Party. And that coverage mimicked to a big extent the coverage of the American Islam and Muslims in the American media post 9/11 leading up to the Iraq War. The only difference here is that it was mainly Muslims doing it to other Muslims in Egypt. What do you think about this?
So first of all, I apologize because it's cutting out a little bit. I think I'm having some internet difficulties, but I think I got most of the question. So let me actually, because you touched on a couple of things. So if I might, I just want to touch on two things quickly. So first of all, in terms of American news media, and you mentioned this, and you're right, that historically Muslims are covered negatively in American news media. They're covered negatively and stereotypically. This is a finding that researchers have. It's a repeat finding, in all of the empirical studies that have been done on the American media. I don't know of many studies that actually conclude anything, other than that. I mean, there are a couple of instances where there are some counter discourses about Muslims, where you find more sympathetic coverage, but for the most part, it's overwhelmingly negative and overwhelmingly stereotypical. I'm talking about mainstream American news media, and I can talk about some of the research that I've done recently if there's time.
Please do.
The other thing you talked about is Egypt, and this is something that's fascinating, is that what we find in Egypt and also in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and elsewhere in the Arab region and in the Muslim majority region is that you have this pocket of countries which is deeply sympathetic to the American and European Islamophobia industry, and they've effectively borrowed the anti-Muslim discourses from Europe and the United States and applied them to local contexts like the Egyptian context. The one caveat, the twist on it though, is that they don't say Islam, they don't say Muslims, they say, the Muslim Brotherhood or Muslim extremists or something like this. But when you actually dig a little bit deeper, really what they're talking about is just any Muslim who believes that Islam has something to say about public life. So any Muslim activist, any Muslim politician, a Muslim who has a beard, Muslim, Muslim women who wear the head cover, the hijab. There are very deeply Islamophobic discourses emerging out of Egypt, out of the United Arab Emirates. If you just took the name away, if you just took the newspaper away and the country away, you would assume that these are like Fox News types, right? Or Sky News types. But they're, as you mentioned, they're Muslims. And so this is something that is fascinating. Go ahead.
Interesting. So no, tell us about your research that you mentioned and how the coverage is going on.
So my co-author, Dr. Mohamad Elmasry, and I have been doing some research on coverage of terrorism in the American news media. And what we tried to do in a couple of our most recent studies is look at terrorist attacks that victimize Muslims on the one hand and non-Muslims on the other hand. And we selected 5 large terrorist atrocities, all of which were perpetrated by Muslims. So we were controlling for that variable. We were controlling for the identity of the attacker in this case. In every case, it was a Muslim, some sort of a Muslim extremist. So we took the terrorist attacks in Ankara, Turkey. We took the terrorist attack in Maiduguri, Nigeria. And then, so those are the 3 attacks that were perpetrated against Muslims. And then we took 2 attacks in the West that were perpetrated mostly against non-Muslims in Paris and Brussels. And all 5 of these attacks happened at the same time, at the end of 2015 and the beginning of 2016. And عشان ما أطولش عليكم, يعني I don't want to talk your ear off. Just to be brief, what we find is that there is a very obvious sort of double standard in the coverage. When terrorists attack Muslims, the victims are not personalized. The Muslim victims are not personalized and humanized, and the attacks themselves are not framed as acts of terrorism, but they're framed as internal conflicts, even though they fit the textbook definition of terrorism perfectly, and they inflict devastating casualties on civilian populations. The other kind of attack, the attack that victimizes non-Muslims, it gets 9 times more coverage, so way more coverage. The attacks are framed as acts of barbaric terrorism, and the victims, as I mentioned, are humanized and personalized. So those are 3 of the primary findings from our most recent studies. One of them is already out, and the other is due to come out later this year in a peer-reviewed journal.
Excellent. And if you don't mind, I will link to the one that was published in the video caption. So another example of what you just mentioned is how the Attorney General Barr used the word jihad just this last week, describing how the media covering Trump's response to the COVID-19 situation. So he said the media is waging a jihad against the Trump administration. There's this, whether it's intentional or unintentional, but it's been erroneous, and it's been decades happening, that misunderstanding of Islamic terms. I actually tweeted at the Attorney General and the Justice Department explaining that jihad in Islam cannot be for something that is negative. It has to be accepted by the Creator, God, Allah. And therefore, what you're describing is erroneous and dangerous. So I don't know, hopefully he gets the message.
Well, I wouldn't hold my breath. I mean, good on you for tweeting at him, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of misuse of terminology. A lot of, I do a lot of work on framing and framing theory, which is something that I would encourage people, even lay people, to, because we're all impacted by the way messages are presented and packaged, the way facts and packaged. But the Trump administration, what's fascinating to me as a media scholar is the extent to which they have waged themselves a war against the mass media. I mean, first few months of his presidency, came out and described the media as the enemy of the American people. He called them fake news, and he named them, by name, the New York Times, CNN. He's naming news organizations, quite literally calling them out, and then wondering why, the news coverage is critical. So this is it's a unique, a very unique time period. In some ways, it's really hurt Donald Trump because you combine his policy record with his discourse on the media, and it's a recipe for critical coverage from mainstream news outlets. So, and that's something that's harmed him. But on the other hand, he's been able to flip this in such a way that he comes across as almost a hero to his supporters. So Fox News and the conservative right-wing radio talk shows, whether Michael Savage and Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and all the rest, they're able to say, look, here's our hero who's finally giving us a voice in the media. Look, they're all against us. They're all against. They're all anti-American. They're anti-Republican. They're anti-Christian. And this has actually served to, I think, galvanize the far right in the United States, which is, as I mentioned, it's a significant movement. I mean, these are significant players. His approval rating is almost 50%. So we're not talking about a tiny minority. And these are people that have felt alienated. They have felt that their voices have not been heard. And now finally, there's somebody in the White House who's giving them voice.
So putting aside Fox News and Breitbart and similar smaller outlets on the far right, do you think the media enabled Trump and his message, or they had a duty to report it? How do you see the performance of the media other than the right-wing media?
Good question. I think we need to devote more research, first of all. Very few systematic studies have been published about media coverage during the Trump era. As I mentioned, it's clear that the coverage has been overwhelmingly critical. Now, what kind of end does that ultimately serve politically? I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, as I mentioned, it's gonna. I think what it's gonna do is probably polarize the country even more than it's already polarized. The people that are on the left are gonna watch CNN. They're gonna watch MSNBC. They're gonna read the New York Times, and they're going to be. There's a sense that the media are just kind of preaching to the choir. They're gonna feel a sense of satisfaction. There's something called selection bias. So people are going out of their way essentially to watch news reports that they know are going to support their opinion or their point of view. On the other hand, though, as I mentioned, people on the right are going to be able to spin this in such a way as to say that, look, we're actually the victims. Look at how far they've gone against the president and against his administration. So I think your question about what kind of end does this ultimately serve is a complicated one. I mean, I don't really have a good answer for you. What I'm grappling with, though, as a media scholar, as somebody who advocates, fairness and balance, right, as two core journalistic principles, the question that I have is, what happens when news media like CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post, what happens when they stop being balanced? And they're not right now, they're not balanced. But, and it's easy for somebody to criticize them and say, well, you're not being balanced, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. But, and here's the part that makes this very complicated, the situation itself is fundamentally imbalanced. You have a person in the White House, at least insofar as I can see, who is deeply unstable. He's doing things and saying things that are, you know, sort of antagonistic, that are anathema to American society and American ideals. And so, what then do you do in that situation? Are you supposed to um, give him equal voice? Are you supposed to pretend as though it's tit for tat and everything's equal and we just play it fair and balanced? Or do you come out and play things more critically? That's, I think, the more kind of philosophical question that I'm intrigued by.
I'm not sure if you were trolling some people, but you used fair and balanced quite a few times here, and you know that's Fox
I
News.
do.
So
I'm quite aware. I'm quite aware.
very well.
They're the one network that they asked me to come on, I think, once, and that's the one place I will never. I promise. I've been on CNN and BBC and Al-Jazeera and other networks. I will not go on Fox News, precisely because they are not fair and balanced. And I know exactly why they want to have me on one of their shows if they ever invited me on.
No, yeah, I mean, we've seen many examples over the years. I want to go back for a minute to the institutional approach to coverage or dealing with Muslims and Islamic terminology. I remember the RAND Corporation wrote a study report for the NYPD back in right after 9/11. And I read that like part of the signs of radicalization to the authors of that report was if a Muslim grows his beard, prays 5 times a day, stop smoking, don't gamble, don't drink alcohol. These were literally signs of radicalization that the NYPD was using to approach Muslims in New York City and beyond. And of course, everything that we know has been exposed in the leaks about the spying network that the NYPD had all over the Muslim communities, even 100 miles away from the city. How do you see, ever since this revelation about the NYPD spying, and then a couple of years after, when Snowden revealed the NSA spying on everyone globally, even not only in the United States, how do you see things moved from then until now?
Well, first of all, thank you for reminding me. I recall that, and you know, this is, I think, symptomatic of something much larger. I think an attempt to try and strip Muslims, not just in the United States, but in many countries, including Muslim majority countries, to try and strip Muslims of core beliefs and practices. I mean, the things that you're talking about are mainstream, right? These are not fringe or extreme practices by any stretch. If you're and this is, and I don't know how far we want to go on this, but you know, the thing that has been tragic in my mind is that some Muslims have joined forces, for lack of a better phrase, with these intelligence agencies and with these in trying to sort of out other Muslims as being quote unquote extremists, right? And I don't want to call people out by name, and I don't want to call things out, but let's just say that politically minded Muslims have been outcast, or at least there's an attempt to try to outcast them and throw. And again, these are attempts. I'm not talking about the FBI. I'm not talking about the Obama administration with its intense surveillance and entrapment programs. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about other Muslims, Muslim scholars, Muslim imams, allying with these intelligence agencies, allying with authoritarian leaders in the Muslim majority, quite literally massacred hundreds of Muslims, relatively more conservative Muslims or political Muslims, whatever you want to call them. I didn't 15 years ago, if you'd have asked me, or 20 years ago, I didn't see that progression. But that's unfortunately where we are, and that's why you see increased amongst Muslims in the West, and Muslims all over the globe.
Mhm. We have about a minute left. I want to touch upon one last question, and we can, hopefully you can grace me by coming again at a later time, maybe after Ramadan, to continue this discussion. But for someone who's trying to find, fair and balanced, to use the term, coverage of anything in today's world, and especially particularly about the political situation in the United States, do you have any recommendations of outlets or resources to find it?
I mean, there are no perfect news outlets. I always tell my students when I teach journalism classes that news is a fundamentally imperfect enterprise. And maybe we could talk about that in a future episode. But there are all kinds of limitations and constraints on journalists. So even the most well-intentioned news outlets can't get everything perfect, and they can't even get everything right. But what I tell my students, and what I'll tell people watching this, if and they can take what I say with a grain of salt, but I would encourage people to consult as many news outlets as possible. And in particular for Americans, what you said toward the beginning of our little talk here today, and that is look to what people are saying outside the borders of the United States. Read what they're saying in the United Kingdom, in Europe. Read what they're saying in some of the Middle Eastern countries, Asia, Africa. Try to find a handful of news outlets and read as many of them as you possibly can. Inside the United States, I really like Democracy Now! They have their blind spots, and they have some of their reporting I take serious issue with, quite frankly. But generally speaking, on many of the issues that we've discussed, more thorough. And I like the word thorough, because I don't think news outlets in the United States are nearly thorough enough, particularly in foreign policy issues and talking about Arabs and Muslims and things like that.
Definitely to be continued. I have many questions about other outlets. Dr. Mohamad Elmasry, thank you very much for coming on the show. Looking forward to having you again in the coming months. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been tonight's episode of Vantage Points. I am Hisham Al-Maligi. There are hashtags and there is a hashtag. This is the hashtag. Take care, America.